inflict a lot of pain on their own populace, and they're going to be willing to do so to win this trade war with the United States.
This is a really bad story for China, where the economy is probably already contracting.
On April 7th, a TikToker filmed a clothing factory that had shut down and said the clothing industry is in serious trouble.
China's economy is crashing so fast that CCP is now banning companies from leaving China. Yep, you heard that right. Apple announced that it will be moving all its production to India, but the CCP said that they won't allow that. It doesn't even stop there. CCP is also rolling back tariffs on hundreds of US goods. I guess China is realizing that they're more dependent on US than US is on cheap Chinese products. Here's more details.
China, I think, is a little bit in a panic. What we're seeing is that they're not imposing tariffs on certain categories of American goods. So, for instance, some semiconductors, industrial chemicals, aviation products that they need, but they're not announcing it, which looks like China is folding because they realize that they need American products that they can't get anywhere else. And also, I think they're probably coming to a realization that they need to take the temperature down. So far, rhetorically, they're saying, well, no, we're not talking to the United States, but I'm sure that they are, because we talk to the Chinese all the time about all sorts of things. And to think that we haven't talked about tariffs during this tariff war just is really strange credulity.
So, Gordon, staying on what you just said, is China backing down? Because yes, Reuters reporting China has dialed back its 125% retaliatory tariffs on, U.S.-made microchips needed for electronic devices, that China is looking at a list of more than 130 categories of U.S.-made products that could be eligible for exemptions from China's tariffs. And as you said, it's also vaccines, chemicals, and jet engines. So are they backing down?
Well, I think they certainly are backing down, but they're trying to do it in a way that they don't look like they're doing that. And I think part of the reason is that Xi Jinping has configured the Chinese political system so that only the most hostile answers are considered acceptable. And he's been telling the Chinese people for a half decade that China's already surpassed the US. So he can't go back to them and say, well, we're talking to the Americans because of pressure. That just doesn't work, because that undermines all of his credibility with the people of China.
Now we'll get into the details of what goods exactly is China taking off its tariff list, but first let's talk about why they're doing this. As you guys just heard, this is exactly Xi Jinping's making. All this time, he's been telling the Chinese public, the Chinese citizens, that China doesn't need United States. That's why he went on that special trip on his special Boeing to Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia. He was telling the Chinese people that they have more than enough support right there in Asia to stand up against United States quote-unquote bullying. But in reality, none of these countries actually joined China in the anti-US coalition. In fact, even Russia is not with China. You see, all those Boeing planes that China said they don't want? Well, guess what? India, Malaysia, and now even Russia is saying that they are happy to buy those planes because they need them so desperately. So what is the CCP doing to fight back against this? Well, the same thing they always do, spread misinformation. In fact, in Philippines, the Chinese embassy was just caught red-handed. The Chinese embassy in the Philippines allegedly contracted PR firm Infinite Us to hire local trolls to peddle fake news and hatred online. A network of pro-China X accounts have been actively running a strategic campaign against Filipino President Marcos Jr. and Philippines' efforts in the disputed West Philippine Sea, while simultaneously boosting content in favor of Vice President Sara Duterte. All this just came out yesterday with evidence. And I know a lot of you guys in the comments don't believe us when we say that the CCP bots are operating in foreign countries and targeting anyone who criticizes the communist government. The CCP is using bots and trolls to interfere in democracies around the world. Far more needs to be done to monitor and counter these attacks. And these attacks are the reason why we ask you guys if you can help us out by hitting that like and subscribe button down below. It truly does help us out tremendously in counteracting these bot activities. Now let's talk about what US goods is China taking the tariffs off from. What can it not live without? China is rumored to be considering exclusions of its retaliatory tariffs on the US. Here are top 30 goods that could be excluded by value. The exclusions would cover more than $46 billion in imports and at least 28% of China's imports from the US based on 2024 figure. Now, I want to remind you guys, $46 billion does sound like a small amount, but China only imports around $140 billion from the US. So this is definitely a big percentage of that. And here in the image, we can see what exactly are they exempting. And these includes turbojets, processors, aircraft material. And this is something we called out just 3-4 days ago. This was exactly when Xi Jinping used his Boeing plane, which was the Chinese presidential plane, to visit Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia, all the while announcing in China that Chinese airlines cannot buy any more Boeing planes. On top of that, the second part of this headline that many people overlooked was the fact that Xi Jinping also banned a lot of maintenance that was done by Boeing on the planes that the Chinese airlines were already operating. And we said that this is not gonna last. This is just one of those bark is louder than actions, because without maintenance, the planes will start falling from the skies like it's happening in Russia. And this is exactly why a lot of these materials that are being exempt are aircrafts related. Now, of course, there are other materials like the semiconductor that's very important to the Chinese tech industry. Now, this is not the highest class semiconductor that the United States or even Taiwan makes. These are the lower grade semiconductors, but even those China cannot live without because they just don't have the technology to match up. They are 10 years behind in their semiconductor industry compared to the West and Taiwan. Now, this brings us to our second point. As you guys know, China's economy is struggling, and the tariff war with the United States is just making it worse. But many people overlook the fact that China imports around $140 billion of goods from the United States, and a lot of those goods, a lot of those products are inputs in the stuff that the Chinese factories make. For example, the semiconductors that China gets from the United States go into the laptops, speakers, phones, keyboards, mic, everything that China is producing and selling to other countries, not even just to United States. So China needs those imports just to sustain its economy, just to keep the factories going that haven't shut down already. And this is another big reason why China is folding. They cannot just let their economy die out all the while announcing to the world that economy is growing at the 5% rate. Because all the secondary data, if you start digging deeper into China's data that they do publish, don't line up with the 5% figure that CCP just announced for their Q1 GDP growth. Here's more details.
Is China vulnerable? Really vulnerable?
Well, we know from February and March price data that the country's in a deflationary spiral. Both the consumer price index and the producer price index have been negative. CPI down for 2 straight months, PPI down for 30 straight months. That's inconsistent with 5.4% growth that they reported for Q1. Also, we saw tax receipts for Q1 down 3.5%. I don't know how you square that with robust growth.
And if they cannot sell, what is it, $300 billion worth of product in America, where do they sell it? They want to sell it at home, but that would be further deflationary, wouldn't it?
Yeah, well, they can't sell it at home because there's just no market demand there. You know, when you had India a couple days ago slap the 12% tariffs on steel, that was directed at China because they don't want their market flooded with Chinese steel that otherwise would have gone to the US. You're going to see other countries do the same thing, which really means China is going to have export problems because that's where they've been looking for growth, but they can't grow it in a world like we have today. And besides, when you add deglobalization, this is a really bad story for Beijing.
Now, this is where we have so many things to talk about. You see, China had a lot of factories that just served the domestic market in China. Now, China's consumption is not that high, especially compared to other developed economies around the world, but they still have around 38% consumption. So 38% of their GDP is just Chinese people spending money on different things in China. But you see, when all the factories that were sending their products to the United States just had their orders canceled by the millions, what did they do? They switched their focus to the domestic market. This means that all those factories that were just serving the domestic markets, they now have to compete with these massive factories that were built just to send their products to the United States. That means all those small factories are now going out of business. The secondary effect of this is that a lot of the products that were already produced to be sent to the United States are now just sitting in China. So what are these Chinese factory owners doing? They're selling these products in the Chinese market for way lower the profitable price. This is basically what China would do in foreign countries. They would go in with their overcapacity, start selling the product for way below the market price so they can run out the other business owners out of business. Now they're being forced to do the same thing in the domestic market. All these big factories that were sending their products overseas, now they are stuck with millions and millions of dollars worth of product. They're now trying to offload it as soon as possible so they get some cash back and they can pay off their bank loans. So what they're doing is they're just having a fire sale. That means all the domestic factories and all the domestic business owners who still have to make a profit, they cannot compete with someone who's just selling their product at a loss to survive. This has led to so many factories just shutting down and furloughing, laying off their employees and workers because they just cannot compete with what's going on in China. I'm guessing this is why yesterday China called a UN meeting. The goal of the meeting was for Chinese ambassadors to complain how US tariffs are breaking the spirit of free trade that this world is built upon. Pretty ironic, and I know you guys are laughing, but I haven't even gotten to the punchline yet. All the while Chinese ambassadors were complaining about free trade in the UN building, CCP in China was actually stifling free trade. You see, because of the geopolitical tensions between the US and China, Apple has had enough. They just announced that they will be moving all their iPhone production out of China and into India. But CCP is not very happy about this. You see, because of the geopolitical tensions between the US and China, Apple has had enough. They just announced that they will be moving all their iPhone production out of China and into India. But CCP is not very happy about this. So, how's CCP responding? Well, they technically just banned Apple from moving out of China. So much for free trade. This was happening all the while CCP ambassadors are complaining in the UN building that US is the one breaking the free trade principles. Earlier this year, Chinese authorities refused to allow one of Apple's Chinese equipment supplier to export machinery to India that Apple needed for the upcoming iPhone 17's trial production. So suppliers got creative. It set up a front company in Southeast Asia to buy the machines. Once the equipment reached the Southeast Asian country, it went to a factory in India operated by Foxconn. In many cases, Chinese authorities are delaying or blocking shipments of iPhone equipment to India without explanation. Foxconn has seen approval times from Chinese authorities for exporting iPhone making equipment from its China factories to those in India rise from 2 weeks to as long as 4 months. They're also rejecting some export applications without explanation. I mean, even though CCP may not want to give an explanation, I think we all know why they are doing this. CCP wants to play hardball so it doesn't look weak in front of Chinese citizens. But by doing so, it's literally doing damage to its economy that's irreversible. Once factories move out, they're not coming back in. But let's talk about the fact that CCP has that much power over Apple, one of the premier brands here in the United States, which at one point was worth more than $3 trillion on the stock market, if I'm remembering correctly. Do we really want one of our most valuable companies to be so dependent on an adversarial country? I think what's happening right now should have happened a lot earlier. Because if we ever go to war, China would have used all these companies' production facilities as leverage.
The first missile to fly is going to be a Chinese ship firing at a US ship in the Strait of Taiwan. That's not the first missile. The first missile is going to be Xi calling up of his buddies in the United States and saying, if the United States government tries to fight this, I'm going to destroy your economy. I will do it. I will do it tomorrow. I will kick all of you out. I will give away all your special waivers. We're going to steal all your factories. We're going to nationalize all your workers. And then we are going to sell iPhones to the entire world. And you will become irrelevant. Like that is actually what he has in his quiver.
Jeez. That's fucking scary.
It's heavy stuff, right?
Yeah.
And the worst part is that, not to be a caricature, but nobody's talking about this. Like, when was the last time you heard this, discussed in an open, like, and it's all obviously true. Like, does anyone dispute that Xi can just destroy Apple? I don't think anyone disputes that. Does anyone dispute that Xi could literally destroy millions of US jobs and trillions, if not tens of trillions in market cap literally overnight with the stroke of his pen? Like, I don't know. I feel like maybe how people felt a little bit during the Cold War, just being under the pressure of, oh man, the nukes could launch at any moment.
Even though the big media companies didn't want to talk about this, we've been talking about this for years. And we'll continue talking about this as long as this problem persists. All thanks to your guys' support. So be sure to hit the subscribe button down below if you haven't already. But bad news for China is not just that we'll continue exposing their plans. The bad news is that other countries are realizing that China really wasn't for free trade. What China truly wants is mercantilism. China basically wants every other country to have their markets open for Chinese products, but CCP doesn't want to offer the same thing in return to foreign businesses. But now everyone's realizing it, and they are heading back to level the playing field. It's not just the United States. Here we have South Korea imposing tariffs on Chinese companies. South Korea imposes temporary anti-dumping duties on Chinese medium and heavy plates. South Korea Ministry of Economy and Finance has imposed temporary 27.9% to 38% on Chinese origin hot-rolled carbon or alloy steel plates. These provisional measures will remain in effect for 4 months until August 23, 2025. Now, this may have something to do with the United States, because President Trump and his cabinet ministers have been saying that we are very close to a trade deal with South Korea. In fact, they may be one of the first countries to have a finalized trade deal announced. And as we have covered earlier on this channel, one of the important conditions that Trump administration is pushing on other countries for a trade deal is that they cannot help China circumvent our tariffs. This is the same playbook that China ran in 2018, and they're trying to do this again. If you guys remember, the tariff war in Trump's first term started back in 2018, but it wasn't finalized until the end of his term because China just dragged out the negotiations. They were hoping that maybe the next president will be easier on China, but unfortunately for the CCP, President Biden didn't roll back any of the tariffs that Trump put on. In fact, he doubled down, targeting China's AI chip industry and its semiconductor industry. And now Trump is back again, and what he's doing, I wouldn't even call it doubling down. I think what he's doing is 200 times down. That means he's really putting maximum pressure on China, and he's also trying to get other countries to come along with us to level the playing field. We can kinda see this happening in real time from the actions of the countries that are negotiating these trade deals behind the scenes. As I just covered, South Korea announced tariffs on Chinese steel, and on top of that, they have started seizing Chinese products in South Korea that are just there to be relabeled. Basically, these products come into the warehouses in South Korea. No value is added to these products. That means nothing is done in terms of production. They're only there so they can have their label changed. So basically, it will go from made in China product to made in Korea, and the only thing that changes is the label. Nothing is done to the product. This is highly illegal, and this is definitely not free trade, as China likes to claim it. Well, South Korea is cracking down on this, as you can see from this report.
Korean customs seized a warehouse in Busan. The warehouse is full of mattresses, all made in China. This isn't something we made ourselves. It is imported. This company is run by Chinese businessmen in order to avoid Trump's anti-dump tariff, and got caught when exporting to US disguised as local product. Above 1.2 million of these mattresses are exported in this way, worth 74 billion. After it reaches South Korea, documents including certificates of origin is also forged. They also deceived people by claiming it as a Korean product. To avoid tariff, Chinese nationals set up local entities. There were also cases that Chinese export secondary batteries, raw materials, to the US. This is how Chinese products are disguised as local products. The amount of these products exported to the US hits 14.6 billion, won by Match, more than an entire year of 2024 amount. On the other hand, there were Koreans importing 5.6 billion won worth of high-end chips from the US, then disguised as low-end products with 1% of actual price. They were caught in Hong Kong when exporting these chips. Korean Customs Service has different tariff rates for each country to prevent circumvention of exports by violating trade regulations. Korea sets up a special investigation team to launch an all-out crackdown operation.
And it's not just South Korea. As we covered yesterday, we already have a memorandum of understanding signed with India when Vice President Vance visited the country. And we also have Brazil getting in on the action. Brazil is trying to benefit from this downfall of China. Foxconn has started assembling iPhone 16e handsets in Brazil as its 10% tariff rate from the US remains among the lowest. Apple is set to be considering ramping up capacity in Brazil and India due to US tariffs. And I think this is the right strategy, and we should be incentivizing American companies which are doing this and punishing countries that are not doing this. Basically, we should have some kind of tariff which is constructed in a way so we don't get too dependent on a single country. Now, I love India, I love Brazil, I love Mexico, but we don't want the same situation happening again where these countries become the main manufacturing hub for the United States products. They get rich selling to the American consumers, and then in the future, they become an adversary. What we really want is we want our supply chain diversified. That means instead of having all these big companies just move their factories from China to India or from China to Mexico, we should have these companies diversify their factories among many different countries, including Vietnam, Cambodia, India, and countries in Latin America. Now, of course, this is not going to be an easy thing to do because at the end of the day, companies want to maximize their profits. And one way they do this is by driving down cost. If you have all your production in one place, you can really cut down on cost a lot. And that means companies wouldn't really want to diversify across many different countries unless they have to. Now, they got people way smarter than me in the administration who should be thinking about this, and I'm hopeful that they are thinking about this. But one idea I have read about is maybe we can have some kind of tariff on every single country that only kicks in if we import above a certain amount. Let's say it's $100 billion. That way, companies who operate at a big scale, they are kind of forced to diversify their production to different countries so they can avoid this tariff that only kicks in if they import all their products from one country. Hopefully, we are thinking something about this because now is the perfect time. As the Secretary of Treasury just announced yesterday, he has more than 100 countries who have reached out to him for trade negotiations. Percent just now. More than 100 countries have approached US on trade. America first does not mean America alone. Now I do want to pause right there to explain a little bit because a lot of people have been making this joke that all the cheap manufacturing is going to come to America and somehow Americans are going to make these products. When in reality, that's really not the goal. We want high value manufacturing to come back to America. That way Americans have high value jobs, high income jobs. And low-value manufacturing can go to many different countries. These could be India, Vietnam, Cambodia, a lot of Asian countries, and then we also have a lot of Latin American countries who definitely want more manufacturing in their nation. So we have a lot of countries who are willing to do this. The goal of the tariff war is to just not be so dependent on China that they can literally wipe off trillions of dollars of market cap on the US stock market by just banning US factories. Anyways, coming back to the report, China's current economic model is unsustainable. They are harming themselves and the entire world. China cannot just keep relying on the US for demand. And the second part is, United States cannot just keep relying on other countries for imports because on a long enough horizon, that's definitely problematic. What is money? It's literally the stuff we can buy. That's what money is for. Think about it. Let's say you have no money, but you have some magic genie that gives you anything you want. Wouldn't you be the richest person in the world even though you have no money? Now, of course, I understand the other side of the argument that we do export a lot of services. And that's definitely a great thing, but we cannot become a nation that just exports services. We do need some manufacturing back. We were saying this when Biden was in office, and we're saying this now that Trump is in office. This is not a political statement. This is truly a national security statement. And that's why in this next clip, we have Warren Buffett explaining why every nation needs to produce goods. He's the greatest investor of all time, and on top of that, he truly loves this country, and he's been ringing the alarm about the trade deficit since 2003.
It was in 2003, Joe. I wrote an article for Fortune actually about the trade deficit. I was worried about it getting too large then because, again, it was getting to be 3% or so of GDP. And it wasn't specific to China at all, but it was just a question of how wise it is to let the trade deficit grow larger and larger, because when you run when you are in effect buying more from other countries than they're buying from you, you are handing them investment funds. I mean, it's the nature. You give them little pieces of paper and they can convert that into buying. They can buy government bonds. They can buy buildings here. And Japanese bought Pebble Beach in the 1980s when they were running a big surplus. I mean, so you are giving up claim checks on our country, essentially, in exchange for having more consumption now than you're producing in this country. And so I do think that there's levels of trade deficit that bother me. I had some system that did not make it country specific. But I think the world has gotten better and better, and there's no question that countries may try and take advantage in this or that, and we've actually been guilty of that sometimes in the past too. I don't think leaders in other countries, whether China or 100 other countries, are not smart enough to realize that it's in the interest to keep promoting trade. The more we trade over time, and we don't want it to be a question of where we import 20% of our GDP and we export nothing. Now, we could all quit working, and we could hand little pieces of paper to the rest of the world, and they can keep sending us food, and they can send us autos, and they can send us all kinds of things. But eventually they have claims on all our wealth. So we do want to have policies where the overall trade deficit does not get out of hand in relation to GDP. And I've been arguing that for a long time.
YouTube is growing so fast that it has just overtaken Netflix to become the most popular app on TV. That's just on TV, by the way. If you combine TV, phones, computers, tablets, people are spending an insane amount of time watching YouTube. This is exactly why YouTube is paying creators $45,000 per minute. That's $64 million every single day. So, if you have ever thought about starting a YouTube channel for yourself, now is the perfect time. And if you're looking to learn how people grow on YouTube in 2025, like this guy who got millions of views in just few months of starting a channel, then I have a solution for you. This weekend, I'm holding a free bootcamp for beginners where I will share all our YouTube advice and answer any question you have about growing on YouTube. If you're interested in learning from this bootcamp, you can sign up by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code on your screen.